I never imagined that moving to Maplewood Gardens, a picturesque, tree-lined neighborhood with neatly manicured lawns and friendly porch waves, would turn into a nightmare. We had moved here 3 years ago, hoping to give our daughter, Zoe, a stable, happy childhood. The neighbors had been welcoming at first, bringing us casseroles and homemade cookies. The HOA president, Mrs. Reynolds, even dropped by to introduce herself, flashing a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We like to keep things orderly around here," she had said. "I'm sure you'll fit in just fine." At the time, I thought nothing of it. How could I have known that fitting in meant obeying unwritten rules, ones designed to push out families like ours? The first sign of trouble wasn't loud or obvious. It was subtle, a missing welcome sign from our front porch, an unreturned wave from a neighbor who once greeted us warmly. Small things, but enough to make the air feel heavier. And then one day, everything changed. It started with Zoe's scream. I was setting the dinner table when the front door burst open, and Zoe came running in, tears streaking her face, her hands clutching her arm. "Mom!" she sobbed, her voice shaking like shattered glass. I rushed to her, my heart hammering in my chest. My first thought was that she had fallen, scraped her knee at the playground. But then I saw her torn shirt, the sleeve barely hanging on, the fabric shredded. And then I noticed the angry red mark on her arm. "Baby, what happened?" My voice came out hoarse. She gulped down sobs, her breath ragged. "Mrs. Reynolds, she grabbed me. She hit me with her clipboard." I felt my entire body go cold. "She what?" She stopped me at the playground and said I was breaking HOA rules. Zoe's voice shook. She said my shirt was offensive and political. I glanced down at what she was wearing. A simple black T-shirt with the words Black Lives Matter printed in bold white letters. It had been a birthday gift from my brother, a civil rights attorney. Zoe had worn it with pride, eager to show support for what she believed in. "She called it propaganda," Zoe whispered. When I tried to walk away, she grabbed me. She took pictures of me and said we'd get a formal warning. A deep, trembling rage bubbled up inside me. Mrs. Reynolds had put her hands on my child, over a shirt. That night, I called my husband, Marcus, the police commissioner for our county. His voice was sharp as steel when I told him. "She did what?" By the time he got home, he had already started making calls. But we had no idea what we were up against. The next morning, I found an official notice in our mailbox. Violation. Political messaging in common areas. Resident. Zoe Williams. Warning. Future violation subject to a $250 fine. At the bottom, Mrs. Reynolds had signed her name with a flourish. I felt the blood rush to my face. This wasn't just about HOA rules. This was personal. I stormed inside, slamming the paper on the counter. "They're trying to make it official now." Marcus took one look at it and set his coffee down hard. "That's not in any bylaw." "I checked," I said. "Nothing in the rules bans clothing with messages." "She's making it up?" He exhaled sharply. "I'll handle it." But as the days passed, I realized the fight wasn't just against Mrs. Reynolds. The whole neighborhood was closing in on us. Neighbors who had once been friendly now avoided eye contact. Mrs. Henderson, who had always chatted about her roses, suddenly acted like they were the most interesting thing in the world whenever I walked by. At the community mailbox, a group of women I had shared coffee with at barbecues fell silent when I approached. I forced a smile. "Good morning," muttered replies. No eye contact. Then they scattered like startled birds. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. When I got home, raw eggs were dripping down our mailbox. This wasn't just about a shirt anymore. It was a message. I felt my stomach turn. Who were these people? And what were they capable of? That evening, Marcus came home looking tense. "They've been busy," he said, loosening his tie. "The mayor called me today." I froze. "The mayor?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Apparently, Mrs. Reynolds' husband plays golf with him." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just an HOA issue. This was political. We decided Zoe should stay away from the park for a while, just until we figured out what was going on. But the next morning, I found a note tucked under our doormat. Control your daughter, or the HOA will. Maplewood has standards. Some residents don't belong here. I stare at the words, my hands shaking. They weren't just trying to push us out. They were threatening my child. Marcus clenched his fist when I showed him. They picked the wrong family. That's when I decided. If they wanted to fight, they were going to get one. 5 days later, a bright orange flyer was delivered to every doorstep in the neighborhood. Emergency HOA meeting. Attendance mandatory. They're making their move, Marcus muttered. Better to face them head on. The night of the meeting, I stood in front of the mirror, smoothing down my blazer. My hands trembled, but I forced myself to breathe. If I walked in there looking afraid, they'd win. Marcus had to work late, so I had to face him alone. As I walked into the community center, the room fell silent. Almost every household was there. All eyes turned to me. At exactly 7 p.m., Mrs. Reynolds stepped up the podium, her perfectly pressed suit and pearl necklace gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that hit a knife. Neighbors, friends, she began. We created Maplewood Gardens as a sanctuary, a place free from conflict, but some residents insist on bringing division into our peaceful streets. I stood up, loudly. My chair scraped against the floor. Are you referring to my 14-year-old daughter wearing a T-shirt that says Black Lives Matter? The room went silent. Mrs. Reynolds' smile tightened. Mrs. Williams, your daughter's political statements are creating tension in our community. No, I cut in. What creates tension is an adult putting her hands on a child. Murmurs spread through the room. I wasn't alone anymore. I had planted the first seed of doubt, and I wasn't stopping there. I barely slept that night. After the emergency HOA meeting, I knew things were about to escalate. Mrs. Reynolds wasn't going to back down, and neither were we. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. At 7 a.m. the next morning, Marcus and I woke to a loud bang on the front door. Marcus grabbed his phone, ready to call dispatch, while I threw on a robe and peeked through the peephole. A yellow notice was taped to our door. I yanked it off and read the words, my stomach twisting. Violation notice. Unapproved lawn ornamentation. Fine. $500. Due immediately. I stare at the words, my hands tightening around the paper. What ornamentation are they even talking about? Marcus asked, his voice thick with irritation. I stormed outside, and that's when I saw it. Our welcome mat, a simple, colorful design that read, Love Lives Here, was gone. Instead, there was a picture taped to the ground. A photograph of it, circled in red. I felt a chill race down my spine. They stole our mat, I whispered, and they fined us for it. Marcus exhaled sharply. They're messing with us. By the time I checked my email, there was another violation notice waiting. This time, unauthorized gathering. Translation, Zoe's study group. They're hitting us from all angles, Marcus muttered. They want to drown us in fines. But they underestimated one thing. I wasn't going to drown. I was going to fight. By mid-morning, I started making calls. First to our neighbors, the ones who had been distant, hesitant. One by one, they answered, their voices tight. I'm sorry, but we can't talk about this, Mrs. Patel whispered. Please don't call again. Click. Another neighbor, Mr. Foster, sighed heavily. I don't want trouble. Click. And then a text message popped up from an unknown number. Drop it before it gets worse. I felt a lump form in my throat. Marcus, still in his police uniform, sat beside me, his jaw clenched. They're afraid. That's when the third violation notice arrived. I stared at it, my heart pounding. This one was different. It wasn't about fines. It was about expulsion. The HOA had officially started the process to remove us from the neighborhood. It was there in black and white. Due to repeated violations and failure to comply with community standards, the board of directors is initiating a motion to revoke your residency privileges. My vision blurred. They wanted us gone. And then, as if the universe wasn't done kicking us, Marcus's phone buzzed. His face darkened as he read the message. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with quiet, restrained fury. They're going after my job. I felt the world tilt. What? The chief just called, he said, rubbing his temples. An anonymous complaint was filed against me, claiming I was using my position to intimidate private citizens. My hands clenched into fists. Mrs. Reynolds. She's trying to get you suspended. I whispered. Marcus set his phone down carefully, his fingers drumming against the table. She can try. But I could see the tension in his shoulders. She had power. She had connections. And now, she was coming after our livelihood. I took a deep breath. We need help. Marcus looked at me. Who do you have in mind? I picked up my phone and dialed. My brother, the lawyer. By noon, Gemma Washington was sitting in our kitchen, files spread across the table. This is harassment, she said, flipping through the documents. And this, she held up the eviction notice. This is illegal. Hope stirred in my chest. We have proof, I told her. Violation notices that don't exist in the bylaws. Threats, even vandalism. Gemma nodded. Good. We're going to use every bit of it. Then she slid a folder toward me. Inside was a lawsuit. File this, she said, and watch how fast their power crumbles. I hesitated. What if they escalate? Gemma smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was sharp. They already have. Now, it's your turn. That's when I made the call, not just to the county court, to the press. 2 days later, the news vans arrived. It was 6 a.m. when I heard the first honk outside. I pulled back the curtain and gasped. Reporters. Not one, not two, 5 news vans. A crowd had formed. Some neighbors stood outside their houses, watching, some embarrassed, some curious, some ashamed. I stepped outside, Gemma beside me. Mrs. Reynolds was already there, storming toward us, her face tight with barely contained rage. She held up a thick stack of papers. Legal documents. This changes nothing, she snapped. But then Marcus stepped forward, and he wasn't alone. 2 uniformed officers stood behind him. One of them held an arrest warrant. The other held a laptop with a video queued up. Mrs. Reynolds' face paled as the screen lit up. A recording of her own voice. We'll get them out, just like we got rid of the Gonzalez family. Once they're gone, Tyler's company can buy the houses cheap. A hush fell over the crowd. The news reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, microphones outstretched. Mrs. Reynolds staggered back. That's... Click. A pair of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. She turned, eyes wide. You can't do this. Marcus met her gaze, calm and steady. You're under arrest for harassment, conspiracy to commit housing fraud, and falsifying legal documents. The officers guided her toward the police car. She screamed. She protested. But no one defended her. As the car door slammed shut, Gemma turned to me. Justice served. And for the first time in weeks, I breathed freely. The aftermath. The story spread like wildfire. By nightfall, news outlets had picked it up. Social media exploded. Neighbors who'd been too scared to speak, now they came forward. More families. More stories. It wasn't just us. Mrs. Reynolds had been running a racket for years, driving out families, buying their homes at dirt cheap prices, reselling them through a shell company. And now, she was finished. The entire HOA board was dissolved. And the people finally had a voice again. A new beginning. A week later, Zoe sat at the breakfast table, scrolling through her tablet. She looked up, grinning. Mom, we're trending. Marcus chuckled. In a good way. I smiled, watching the headlines flash across the screen. Corrupt HOA exposed. Homeowners win back their rights. Family stands against discrimination and wins. I turned to Marcus, squeezing his hand. We did it. And for the first time in a long time, our home finally felt like home again. I should have felt relief. Mrs. Reynolds was gone, arrested, her secrets exposed for the world to see. But the battle wasn't over. Not yet, because as I stepped outside the morning after her arrest, I found one last letter taped to our front door. It was from the HOA's legal team. Even with their leader in handcuffs, the remaining board members were making one final, desperate move. The letter was an eviction notice. 72 hours. That's how long they were giving us before they came in with movers to forcibly remove us from our home. My hands clenched around the paper. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew what this was. A power play. A final act of revenge. They wanted to scare us, break us, make an example out of us. But they didn't realize one thing. I wasn't scared anymore. I turned on my heel, walked inside, and grabbed my phone. It was time to end this. Within hours, I had Jamma on a conference call. "This is a bluff," she said, flipping through documents on her end. "They don't have the authority to remove you. Then why are they trying?" I asked. "Because they're desperate," Jamma replied. "And desperate people make mistakes." That's when Marcus walked into the room, his face serious. "I just got a call from a whistleblower." I turned to him. "A whistleblower?" He nodded. "One of the HOA board members. He wants to come clean." Within an hour, we were sitting across from a man I barely recognized. It was Mr. Foster, the same man who had once turned away from me at the mailbox. Now he looked haunted. He swallowed hard, his fingers twisting the fabric of his shirt. "They made me do it," he whispered. "Reynolds, the board, they threatened my family, my job, my mortgage." Marcus leaned forward. "Tell us everything." And so he did. Every corrupt scheme, every falsified violation notice, every family that had been targeted before us. Then he handed me a USB drive. "What's this?" I asked. Mr. Foster exhaled. "Proof." The moment I plugged it into my laptop, my jaw dropped. It was everything. Emails, financial records, HOA minutes that proved the board had conspired to remove certain families. I turned to Jamma, my heart pounding. "Is this enough?" She smiled. "More than enough." I hit send. Within minutes, news stations were picking up the story. Leaked HOA documents reveal systematic discrimination in Maplewood Gardens. Families illegally forced out of their homes. Where's the justice? By noon, the mayor himself had released a statement. And by nightfall, the remaining HOA board members had resigned. Every last one. The corrupt empire they built collapsed overnight. But something else happened, too. Something even more powerful. For the first time since this nightmare began, our neighbors came back. One by one, they knocked on our door, with apologies, with stories, with regret in their eyes. Mrs. Patel, who had ignored my calls, wiped a tear from her cheek. "I was scared," she whispered. "But you stood up for all of us." Mr. Henderson shook Marcus's hand. I should have spoken up sooner. And then Zoe came running into the room, eyes wide with excitement. "Mom, Dad, come look." We followed her outside and my breath caught. A crowd had gathered on our front lawn. Dozens of people, holding signs. HOAs cannot override civil rights. Stand with the Williams family. Justice for Maplewood Gardens. A single tear slipped down my cheek. For so long, we had been fighting alone. But not anymore. The next morning, the final blow came. The judge ruled in our favor. The eviction notice, thrown out. The remaining HOA, dismantled. The families that had been forced out, they were entitled to compensation. And Mrs. Reynolds? She was officially charged with fraud, discrimination, and conspiracy. That night, we watched as the police raided her house. Boxes of documents, files labeled target list. Marcus turned to me, shaking his head. She had it all planned. I nodded. And now, it's over. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. The next morning, I woke to Zoe bouncing on our bed. She was grinning. "Mom, Dad, we're trending again." Marcus groaned, rubbing his eyes. "In a good way?" I grabbed the tablet from Zoe's hands and laughed. The headline read, "HOA Corruption Exposed. A Family's Fight for Justice Changes Everything." And right below it, a picture of us, standing in front of our home. Marcus wrapped his arm around me, chuckling. "So what now?" I smiled. Now, it was time to rebuild. Later that day, as I sat on our front porch, a group of neighbors approached me, Mrs. Patel, Mr. Foster, and a few others. They looked at each other before Mr. Foster finally spoke. "We need a new HOA," he said. "An honest one that protects homeowners instead of preying on them." He took a deep breath. "And we were hoping you consider leading it." I blinked. "Me?" Mrs. Patel nodded. "You're the reason we still have our homes. You fought for all of us." I looked back at Marcus and Zoe, thought about everything we had been through, the fear, the battle, the victory, and then I turned back to my neighbors, smiled, and said, "Let's do this." Because Maplewood Gardens wasn't just a neighborhood, it was our home, and no one was ever going to take that from us again. The end.